Embarrassed when I realize I only speak one language and that poorly and far too quickly. So I apologize in advance as my Australian accent just gets more and more aggressive and I speak far too quickly. There's nothing I can do about it. I have tried and I have failed. I thought what I would do here for the next 20 minutes, if it was okay with all of you, was talk a little bit about the context in which I think collective action in an information and digital age will happen. I've somewhat cheekily entitled this presentation A Post-PC World with a question mark because I think it is probably too soon to call the death of the PC, particularly as I look around this room and see so many of them already open. I tend to think of the post-PC world claim as being more like our claim to a paperless office and a cashless society. They're aspirational calls and they signal a change in our behaviour but hardly signal the end of paper, cash or PCs. What I wanted to do here was sketch out a little bit of where I think the future is going. By way of introduction, however, I realise there are some things I should say about myself and about the work I do at Intel. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. That makes me a somewhat odd creature at Intel. I study people, their everyday practices, and I'm most happy in people's homes all over the world. I also always have to point out to my colleagues at Intel and to my friends who are engineers that I've been an anthropologist ever since I was a child. My mother is also an anthropologist. I was raised on her field sites in Central Australia. I lived with Aboriginal people in the time when they can still remember what their country was like before Europeans came along. And I spent my critical years, when I should have been in school learning, obviously, French and German, I was instead learning how to kill things. This means I am very handy in extracting snakes and lizards out of snakes and lizard holes, and I know how to get water out of frogs. Unfortunately, this means I don't actually know how to order coffee in any language that's useful inside the EU. What it does mean, however, is that I know how to think about people and culture and everyday practice. My job at Intel is to bring stories back from the rest of the world to influence our technology direction, how we think about technology, and to contextualize the conversation about where technology is going with people's everyday and lived practices. What I want to do here is spell out for you some of the trends we've seen in the last 15 years we've been doing this at Intel in our work that is intensely global. As I was thinking about the conference yesterday and today, I was really struck by the fact that we operate in an incredibly changed landscape of technology. The conversations we're having now we simply couldn't have had 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But that rate of increase is hardly a new thing, and indeed as we move forward, the changes that we are set to operate within are dramatic. When I talk to the technologists at Intel, and indeed when I talk to technologists the world over, there are some stakes in the ground I think we need to make, and I have about 10 here I want to rehearse very quickly for you. One of them is the world of technology users is being radically reimagined as we speak. When I joined Intel in 1998, 70% of the world's internet users were located inside the United States. That's 7-0. In 2008, less than 16% of the world's internet users were in the United States. The fastest growing groups online spoke Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi, Bengali. They brought with them profoundly different notions about what the internet might look like and about what it meant to use technology. In parallel with that shift in who it is that's using technology, we know there are profound demographic shifts going on that fundamentally transform who it is that will use technology and how. The world is undergoing a rapid move to an urban environment. I know many of you know this, but 10 years ago about 50% of the world's population was urban. Now it is more than 65%. By the end of this decade, we're talking about 70 to 75% of the world's population living in urban metropolitan centres. Not all of them look like Brussels. Some of them look like Jakarta. Some of them look like cities in Beijing, cities in China that have 1 million people but look nothing like a city of 1 million people you can imagine. If we want to talk about collective action, we need to imagine that's going to happen in metropolitan centres that bear very little in common with the ones that surround us here, but are ones where struggles for electricity and water, as well as transportation, will compete with struggles to get access to technology, the internet and mobile telephony. It's also the case that the world is ageing rapidly. I know none of us like to believe that, but as we look around the room, chances are we reflect quite well what's happening in Europe and in North America, which is the world is ageing. The population of young people on whom we frequently put our great hopes, in fact, represent a smaller percentage of the population than we in this room do. As we look to some of the very big populations on the planet, China, for instance, more than, I forget exactly what the figure is, but there are more people in China over the age of 50 than there are under the age of 18. The silver wave, as it is sometimes called, in Asia in particular, is a staggering one and will fundamentally rewrite the demographics of the world, I suspect what that means is that some of the collective action and some of the collaborative activities we imagine engaging in will bring people who are in their 50s, 60s and 70s into sharp focus, not people in their 20s and 30s. And what that means may suggest very different forms of social integration and social congress. It's also the case, and I flag this here very briefly, that one of the dynamics that I find myself paying a great deal of attention to is that in the last 10 years, one of the other populations that has come into stark relief as a consumer of technology turns out to be women. We talk a lot about how technology early adoption happens with men. I can tell you from the data I track that women are now the early adopters of some of the most important technology on the planet. Women represent 65% of all users of social networking sites. They also represent somewhere around 65 to 70% of e-book users, and they turn out to be the bulk of users of smartphones if you exclude enterprise users. So we might need to think about women in some different ways, not as people who needed to be helped into technology, but people whose technology habits we should attend to. This is a sign from my home country in Australia. It suggests that the internet is a destination. If you've been to Australia, it might also suggest the internet is a destination you could choose to avoid. I'm particularly interested in thinking about the way the internet has been fundamentally remapped, not just in terms of the people who use it, but in the things that it connects. And here I want to suggest that the internet has gone feral. I use that term as an Australian, something that was once domesticated and that is now wild. Here the internet connects mobile phones, smart electrical meters, televisions. As it connects every one of those devices, not only is the internet transformed, but so is the device that it connects. Paying attention to what the internet will look like 5 years from now is not just about imagining that it will connect 10 billion things, but what in connecting those 10 billion things it will be transformed into. We know that as television came to the internet was transformed. Those of you who live in the United Kingdom will remember when iPlayer turned up and the BBC back library suddenly became available, that the internet in Britain slowed by 30% because it turned out every British consumer wanted to watch old BBC content. There was a very big fight in Britain about this, and the ultimate resolution of it was one between the British government and the ISPs in Great Britain and the BBC, where the BBC offered that it would only put new content online after 11 o'clock at night. They created television hours for the internet. Imagine what is going to happen as the internet connects more and more objects, how it will be transformed, both as a platform in which we might engage in collective action, but also as a place where things are going to happen or not. I've spent 12 years in the tech industry. I've heard a lot of people talk about convergence. There is a perennial search for the one device to rule them all, as though Tolkien somehow understood the technical world. It is the case that there is no one device to rule them all. Instead, what we have is increasing device density. Consumers own more and more devices. Not because none of these devices do the work they're supposed to, but it turns out that we actually like to have lots of things, all of which support different activities. People have in their various ensembles of technology everything from mobile phones to laptops to smart televisions. This young man here in this picture has 15 discrete technology objects. He would have been in some ways an ideal market for an iPad. We asked him why he didn't have one. He said it wouldn't fit in his tracksuit pocket and he was afraid he'd look like an idiot. Turns out people have very different reasons for why it is they buy technology or don't. But the chances are, if we imagine that collective action or indeed any sustained encounter is going to happen on one platform, we are kidding ourselves. The chances are consumers are going to have many different platforms and choose to be very different people when they use those platforms and in the ways they use them. So how we stitch together activity will rely on understanding that there will be many different devices with many different service plans, provisionings, and all manner of other, in some ways of configuring the network. In all of that, I have to keep reminding all the technologists I know that whilst we may talk a lot about digital technologies, there are some persistent, stubborn other technologies that haven't gone anywhere. In the 10 years when the internet has exploded in our lives and we watch and consume more content on the internet than was ever anticipated by the people who architected it 40 years ago, television has not gone away. In the United States, American consumers watch 20% more television than they did 10 years ago. Fastest growing group watching more television turn out to be 20 to 30-year-olds. In Europe, just in case you somehow think you might have missed this trend, you actually watch somewhere between 10 to 15% more television than you did 10 years ago. That means despite all the time you think you're spending online, television is still one of the most dominant platforms for the distribution of entertainment, news, stories, and for shaping worldview. The average consumer in Europe spends somewhere between 25 to 27 hours online a month, but over 127 hours watching television. Television still fundamentally shapes the way we view space and time and our relationships with other people. Contending with television turns out to be an incredibly important way of how we think about what the future looks like, because my suspicion is it's not going anywhere. It's also the case when we think about new technologies that there are new ways we want to experience them. This is Peter. We've been visiting his family in the UK for over 2 years now. Peter is going through a developmental stage where he likes to touch everything. Unfortunately for Peter, it turns out touching everything in 2010 means everything responds. I imagine he will grow out of this. I know his mother hopes so too. It turns out you shouldn't touch IKEA cabinets with your nose and hope something happens. But what Peter does point to here is the salience of touch as a profoundly good experience when it works and when it works well. I'm willing to bet most of you in this room have stood in front of an ATM or a cash point machine and banged on the screen repeatedly, waiting for something to happen, before you realise that it's an old-fashioned cash point machine and it has buttons on the side of the screen. Part of the reason that happens is it turns out banging on the screen with a cash point machine is a very satisfying and gratifying experience, and we don't want to go back to the old way of doing it. Touch, however, isn't going to work for everything. You don't want to touch your nice, glossy, big television screen. People don't want you touching your car. There's all manner of places where touch won't work. And while I know we spend a lot of time talking about voice and gesture, I can tell you those have challenges too, particularly when we're talking about more than one person attempting to interact with a device simultaneously. One of my engineers recently pointed out to me that he had solved the problem of the remote control. We were just going to basically talk to our televisions, and I somewhat meanly suggested to him that he lived alone. He said that was true, but he wondered how I knew. And I suggested that he'd never attempted to negotiate over the control of a remote control with someone, and that we couldn't actually make televisions work out who was in charge in our relationships any more than we could work that out. So touch and gesture will be important, but where they fit is going to be particularly critical. And as we think about what it means to have activities that are community and socially based, voice and gesture are complicated technologies to weave into an activity beyond the individual. I know we talk a lot about social networking sites. I'm always struck by the fact that we seem to think that all social networking sites begin and end with Facebook. That's tempting because it does have a lot of users. But Facebook represents only 50% of all online social networking sites. The rest are taken up by a series of sites in China most of us haven't heard of, but QQ Zone and RenRen would be two of them, along with Okrit, Bebo, and about 6 different sites that operate in the former Soviet Union, all of which do social networking, most of which traffic in very different experiences than Facebook. But while we're on the subject of Facebook, while it is the case that they have a great many users, the number of users they have who engage in a great many interactions is actually much less. Many people registered, not many people regular users. The fastest growing groups on Facebook that are regular users turn out to be women in their 50s, 60s and 70s. The fastest growing groups of people signing up to Facebook turn out to be all people in their 50s, 60s and 70s. Some of the youth I interview suggest the point at which their grandparents turned up on Facebook made it time that it was possible they left. Thinking about what it means that comes after Facebook when Facebook becomes the silver set is an interesting prospect. It's also the case that as Facebook has normalised in our lives, some of the activities that happen on it look very different. I noticed with some interest that the New York Times carried a story 2 days ago to suggest that the most trafficked site on Facebook these days is a site called Jesus Daily, which is run by a doctor out of Miami. While it only has 8.7 million users, which makes it 25% of the Justin Bieber fan group. Justin Bieber is in fact the most popular website on most popular Facebook site, unsurprisingly, with 34 million users. While this site only has 88.4 million users, it gets more traffic than any other site, any other piece of Facebook, upwards of 1 million interactions a week. So as Facebook normalizes into people's lives, it turns out it becomes all the things you might expect. It's about dating and religion and gossip and about daily practice. And as these new sites come into our lives, as they start to stabilize, they become much more about the things and the traffic of everyday life. They become in some ways deeply mundane. Hey, I want to go to the next slide. Damn you. There we go. All right. And almost last but by no means least here, I know we talk a lot in the EU and in Australia, where I'm from, about what it's going to mean to have a national broadband network in the Australian case, about what it means to broadband the EU here. And we know that getting connected is a hugely important thing. I'd also argue that staying connected turns out to be more difficult than just getting connected. I also know that it is worth, in some ways, critically interrogating the statistics about connectivity. This is one of my researchers in India. Those of you who don't track Indian data use statistics, in India 10 years ago there were 10 million mobile phones. There are now 850 million mobile phones. It's the fastest mobile phone ramp in recorded history. Of those 850 million mobile phones, most data analysts suggest that somewhere less than 10 to 15% of them are quote-unquote smartphones. The rest of them are what are lovingly in the industry called feature phones, or for the purposes of this conversation, dumb phones. What that suggests, of course, is that Indians aren't using these phones for anything beyond calling. This is, of course, to utterly miss the point. If you go to India and you pry a phone out of anyone's hands, you will discover the phone is full of digital content. It's an interesting question as to how it gets there if these phones aren't actually connected to a network that anyone knows how to track. It turns out the network is composed of young men like this who operate stands in every train station, every housing colony, and every suburb and every mall, and you bring your phone to them, and for a very nominal price they fill your phone with content. You bring your phone back at the end of the week and they delete all that content and add more. The network here is human. It's a series of nodes. It is paid for, your phones are catered to, and the knowledge and the information and the content moves absent a technical network. So when it is that we think about networks, when it is that we think about tracking what it means to be connected and what it isn't, I suggest there are some different questions we might need to ask. In the absence of 3G and mobile broadband, how is it that people share information? Well, it turns out there are whole mechanisms for doing that. I also can tell you from the work we are doing that one of the things that is increasingly at play is that human beings are also seeking places to be disconnected from technology. As much as I can talk about the rise of broadband and the Internet of Things and an increasing nation of connected objects, one of the things we've also been tracking is the tension between the design of technical devices that are designed to work best when constantly connected. All of the devices on your desks here and in your backpacks are designed to work best when they're connected to the information and an electrical grid. Human beings, as it turns out, function better when they're intermittently disconnected. This is a sign from a church in Korea, one of the most broadband connected places in the world and certainly one of the highest density of mobile phones. This sign in Korean reads, "It would be a blessing if you turned off your mobile phone." The sign next to it reads, "Turn off your mobile phone and listen to the call of God." The third sign suggests that it really doesn't matter what you do because this church has a cell site dampener and none of your phones will ring anyway, and this was just a polite way of suggesting a different sort of behaviour. What it does suggest, however, is that people are seeking out places where they can be disconnected, and for as much as we talk about connecting people, we also might want to think about what it means to allow places where people can be strategically disconnected. Turns out in many places we're tracking consumer behaviour. Consumers are, in fact, in the upper income brackets, are more than willing to pay to take their vacation or their holidays in places where they can't get connected. Turns out the demands of the technology are such that people are actively seeking out being disconnected. Now, I might argue from a political economy point of view that if you can buy your way out of being connected, that's one thing. What if you can't afford to buy your way out of connectivity? Where does that leave you? And if you feel overwhelmed and you can't afford to take a vacation somewhere where the technology doesn't work, how do you find a way not to be connected? So carving out spaces of non-connectivity may actually turn out to be an interesting strategic challenge. This comes from my favourite American website of all time. This comes from a website called ratemynetworkdiagram.com. You should think of this as the network diagram set for the hot, like basically rate my professors, rate my dates. This will be rate my network diagrams. People in America, and indeed around the world, draw their network diagrams of their home networks, post them to this website, and all the participants on this website rate them. Holding aside the fact that that is a very scary use of people's time, this is in fact a simple network diagram that is rated very highly by this website. My single comment here is if this is a simple network diagram, we are mostly screwed. Chances are if we are asking consumers to manage this level of complexity, this is an enormous challenge. When I talk to my government back home, one of the things we inevitably find ourselves talking about is that the network and the technology have sprung out far ahead of the ecosystem of support to take care of them. There is no moral equivalent at this point of the plumbers for the digital age, or the panel beaters, or the architects, or the people who issue parking tickets or do interior decoration, or indeed who are the builders of all of this. We know how to make this, but we have no ecosystem for supporting it. Instead, we're asking consumers to manage that, and that is a fairly difficult ask. And if we're all going to end up with network diagrams like this, I'm going to suggest it's not a good space to imagine life, let alone collective action. So last, and by no means least here, it turns out that there are two other things that are at play. One is that consumers are developing new sets of anxieties, socio-technical ones, about all the technology in their lives. I interviewed a woman recently and she said she had TiVo guilt. I asked what that was, and she said she knew her TiVo loved her because it collected a lot of content that it knew she wanted to watch. She felt guilty because she didn't have time to watch it all. She felt bad about the fact that the device was taking care of her, and yet she was not, in fact, basically fulfilling her end of the social bargain. As it is that we imagine devices doing more caretaking of us, this kind of animistic relationship is not out of the question. It's also the case that we see consumers shifting, more importantly in your world, from conversations about privacy to conversations about reputation. And last but by no means least, and this is specifically in some ways for this audience, it turns out it's an increasingly complicated and crowded conversation when we talk about who has a stake in the future. We talk about thinking about new technologies, about new networks, about new forms of services and applications, who it is that will regulate those environments, who it is that will be responsible for them, and who feels they should have a seat at the table is more complicated than it ever was. And we're now talking about the coming together of technologies from telephony, from broadcast. We're talking about infrastructure. We're talking about payment structures. We're talking about people who regulate everything from social activity to public decency to notions about education. All of those things are at play here, and what it means to have a conversation about collective action or about the future is also to have a conversation about who's going to want a seat at the table and how we accommodate those things. But, of course, because it's good to end on an optimistic note, I think there are a remarkable set of wonderful possibilities, and I'm now greatly looking forward to hearing my colleagues discuss them. So thank you.